We are, as Brother Alex just read, in John chapter 7. We'll be in verses 1 through 24 this morning. John 7, verse 1 through 24. This morning, what I want to talk with you about is the unrighteous judgments of unbelief. The unrighteous judgments of unbelief. I'm going to show you in this passage what I'm seeing here, which is four expressions of unrighteous judgments. Four expressions. Surely there are more expressions, more ways in which unrighteous judgments are voiced. But I simply want to exhort you this morning, summarize the sermon like this, but exhort you this morning to beware the unrighteous judgments of unbelief. Beware, be watchful. Be careful that these unrighteous judgments do not come from you. Be in tune to knowing what they are, so that when they do come out, you see it, you recognize it, you confess it to the Lord, you repent of it and say, Lord, I believe. Lord, help my unbelief. Lord, let me not make these kinds of judgments about you. Lord, make me to judge righteously. Make me to judge rightly. Make my heart pleasing to you. So in order to avoid these things, we want to first identify these unrighteous judgments, rather these expressions of unrighteous judgments. In our previous month, we looked at the bread of life discourse where Jesus provided bread for the people, and then there in the synagogue of Capernaum, he's teaching, and they're asking him for signs, they're asking him for miracles and wonders, and he has just performed for them the breaking of the bread, the multiplying of the loaves and the fish for the thousands and thousands of people. But you see there in their response, it does not matter what works Jesus does in their presence. Miracles do not produce faith. Signs do not produce faith. The gift of faith is a miracle. Signs and miracles don't produce faith. The gift of faith is the miracle. Jesus is going to speak to that here in just a little while, that if anybody has in their heart to do the will of God, they're going to know that Jesus is true. How is that? Well, it's God's changed their heart. God has performed this miracle of giving them faith. He's changed their heart. He's given them the ability not only to move past unbelief, but just to wholeheartedly accept the words of Jesus. 'Tis so sweet to trust in Jesus, just to take him at his word. You're going to see in this passage these expressions of unbelief, and hopefully as you see this, you sing those song lyrics in your mind. 'Tis so sweet to trust in Jesus, just to take him at his word. Lord, thank you for delivering me from this way of thinking, from these unrighteous judgments, these unrighteous beliefs. And I'm afraid that it is true that as I walk through this passage and identify these expressions of unbelief, that we're all going to be convicted. We're all going to hear this, we're all going to see this, and we'll all be convicted at certain points. And you'll probably look at your heart, just like I look at my own, and you'll say, man, I've thought that way before. I've done that. I've felt that way about God before. It's not right. And I've had to pray as I read this passage and study it, say, Lord, forgive me. Forgive me for thinking these things. Forgive me for thinking this way. Lord, help my unbelief. When you look at this passage, I want you to understand that as Jesus goes to Jerusalem for the Feast of Booths, that his time there, the accounting of his time there in John's Gospel, actually goes all the way through the end of chapter 7. In 50-something verses. We don't have time to cover that many verses this morning, so we're just going to cover these first 24 verses. But mind you, this is going to take us a few weeks to get through Jesus' interaction with the people, even the people there in the temple. Okay? So we're going to look at verses 1 through 24, and we'll look at it in two sections. The first section does not happen in Jerusalem. The first section happens in the northern region of Israel in Galilee. The second section of the passage this morning happens in the southern part of Israel in Judea, and specifically in Jerusalem. So think of it that way. Galilee to the north, the region to the north, and then Judea to the south, where Jerusalem is the capital there of Judea. So these two sections fall out like this. In verse 1 through 9, you see the unbelief of Jesus' brothers. That's a startling statement, isn't it? The unbelief of Jesus' brothers. How could his brothers not believe in him? Haven't they been there to see all of it? Haven't they been there all of their lives witnessing him? He's the oldest. Surely they believe in him. If anybody is going to believe in you, surely it would be your family. No. Jesus came to his own. Didn't John say this? He came to his own, and his own did not receive him. So Jesus' own brothers don't believe in him. But I want to give you this already. There is hope. There's hope for Jesus' brothers, and I hope to show that to you here towards the end. But nonetheless, in verse 1 through 9, we see the unbelief of Jesus' brothers. There in verses 10 through 24, you see the unbelief of the Jewish crowds. The unbelief of the Jewish crowds. Thus, we could rightly say there's unbelief all around. All around. Everyone, it seems, that Jesus encounters does not believe in him. His family doesn't believe in him. The Jews don't believe in him. In fact, even one of his disciples doesn't believe in him. Very, very small number of people truly believe in Jesus. And that's, in fact, the truth that we learned last week. Very few people actually believe in Jesus with their whole heart. So let's look at verses 1 through 9, and we'll see the first expression of unrighteous judgment here. Verse 1 through 9, it begins this way. After this, that is, after the bread of life discourse, Jesus went about in Galilee, the northern part of Israel. He would not go about in Judea, the southern part of Israel, with its capital Jerusalem. He would not go about in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. So he's staying in the northern part of Israel because in the southern part of Israel, and specifically in Jerusalem, the Jews were seeking to kill him. Why is it that the Jews who were seeking to kill him were located in Jerusalem? Well, it's because that is the religious epicenter of Israel. This is where the scribes and the Pharisees would all live. That is the religious elite, the 70 elders of Israel that functioned as their governing body. This is where they all lived in Jerusalem. And Jesus knows that they are desiring, seeking, in fact, to kill him. So he is not going to Judea. He's not going to Jerusalem. Why is he not going there? Well, in fact, he tells us exactly why. But I want to point out to you one word here, one verb that's introduced to us here in verse 1, and it is the verb to seek. The verb to seek. Now, if you could see this in the Greek, you would actually see this verb used repeatedly throughout this passage. Seeking, 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 looking very hard, looking diligently, looking intently to do something, to be known. And you will see that when this verb is used of people other than Jesus, that all of the seeking of the people is the seeking of unbelief. They're seeking something all right, but they are not seeking to love and believe in Jesus. They are seeking, they are looking. In fact, they're looking intently, not to love Jesus, not to believe in Jesus. This is the foolish nature of designing a church to be seeker sensitive. The Bible tells us there is none who seeks after God. No, not one. So if you want to build a church of unbelievers, then you cater to the things that unbelievers seek. Unbelievers seek entertainment. They seek emotional stimulation, want to feel alive even though they're spiritually dead. And so you can fill a room with a bunch of unbelieving, lost, dead spiritually people, but you're not going to populate a church by being seeker sensitive. There is none who seeks after God. No, not one. Again, all the seeking, you'll see it, all of the seeking of these people is not seeking to believe in Jesus. In fact, it's seeking to discredit him, and it's seeking even to kill him. So moving on here, this unbelief, it says doesn't go to Judea, won't go to Judea, because why? Because the Jews were seeking to kill him. They want to put him to death. Why? We'll get to that point too. Verse 2, now the Jews' Feast of Booths was at hand. What is the Feast of Booths? There are 3 main feasts or festivals, celebrations, spiritual celebrations, religious ceremonies in Israel in the Old Covenant. You have the Feast of Passover, commemorating when the Lord passed over Egypt and avoided killing the Israelites' firstborn child because of the blood of the lamb smeared on the doorpost. You have the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Passover, commemorating the Lord bringing the people out of Egypt. Then you have the Feast of Weeks. You have the Feast of Weeks, 49 days after Passover, to celebrate the initial harvest, to celebrate the Feast of First Fruits, as it were, the first parts of the harvest, the early harvest of the year. You celebrate the Feast of Weeks because you are trusting that God is going to bring second fruits. But then at the end of the year, you have another feast. You have the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Ingathering. The Feast of Booths, think of booth, the word there for booth is the word for tabernacle, has the word skene in it. Tabernacle is a tent. So you could say it's the Feast of Tents, the Feast of Tabernacles. And so what is it that they were doing in these tabernacles, in these tents? Well, the Feast of Booths was a commemoration of how the Lord provided for the people of Israel as they wandered through the wilderness for 40 years. What is it that the people lived in the wilderness? Well, they lived in booths. They lived in these tabernacles, these tents. And so to remind the people of Israel annually and perpetually that the Lord provided for their ancestors in the wilderness, this great act of deliverance into the land of promise, they were to observe these 3 feasts. And so you know about what time of year it was when this Feast of Booths was going on. It's the end of the year. Not only are they celebrating this commemoration of the Lord providing in the wilderness, but it's also called the Feast of Ingathering. The final part of the harvest. The final part of the harvest and the vintage. That is the harvest of the grains and the harvest of the grapes, the vintage. And so this was a celebration. Not only was it a celebration, there was also a time of solemnity. There's a solemn assembly where the people of Israel, at the beginning of this 7-day feast, they gathered together for a solemn assembly to humble their heart before the Lord. And at the end of 7 days of eating and celebrating the Lord's good gifts to them, they'd have another solemn assembly. And you would think people gathered in Jerusalem for this solemn assembly, they are seeking God. They are worshiping God. They are loving God. They've gathered together in the city of God to worship God. And they're trying to kill the Son of God. All of these religious practices, all of these religious works that are being done. And yet what is written is true. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. The children of Israel were very far from God, still doing all of the religious things, but not knowing God. beware. Beware the signs of unbelief. Beware of this because you can, in fact, be carrying out all of the religious duties that you believe are assigned to you. You could be a faithful church member, a faithful giver. You could be faithful in many, many areas, but your heart be far from God. Well, beware of that. Hey, and if you were to walk around Jerusalem, Brother Garrett, and you were to observe, what would you think? You'd think, this is a bunch of spiritual people. These are a bunch of religious people. These are godly people. These are saints. But in their hearts, what are they? They're dead. They're dead. So just understand that you can have the appearance, like Paul says, the appearance of godliness, but deny its power. Such is the case with these people. And their unrighteousness, their unrighteous judgments betray the fact that they are unbelieving. All right. So it says, now the Feast of Booths, verse 2, the Jews' Feast of Booths was at hand. It was near, it's approaching. And so what are we supposed to do? Well, if you are an obedient, observant Jew, you go to Jerusalem if you are able. The males in Israel were commanded 3 times a year to go to Jerusalem and observe these feasts. And so all the men are preparing. They're all getting ready to go to Jerusalem to observe this year's end Feast of Booths, this Feast of Ingathering. So, verse 3, his brothers said to him, leave here and go to Judea, to the south, to Jerusalem, that your disciples also may see the works you are doing. Now, I hope you can see that at the beginning of that quotation, it says, leave here and go. Grammatically, those are called imperatives. Those are commands. You can already tell they don't believe in Jesus as the Son of God because you don't command God to do anything. Leave here and go. That's the first sign of their unbelief. The second sign of their unbelief is really in their ignorance. What do they say? Leave here and go to Judea that your disciples also may see the works you are doing. Well, his disciples have been seeing the works he's been doing. His disciples have been with him all the way. In fact, the ones who were seeing all the works he were doing, they just left him. The ones who ate the bread and ate the fish. The ones who saw the healings out in the wilderness on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. What did they all do? Jesus said, unless you eat my body and drink my blood, you don't have life in you. And they all leave. Jesus turns to the 12 and he says, you gonna leave too? And Peter says, well, Lord, where will we go? You have the words of life. And we have come to know and to believe that you are the Son of God. His disciples have seen enough. They don't need to see more works. His brothers really are just manifesting very clearly here their lack of faith in him. So his brothers, verse 3, said to him, leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples may see the works you are doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. Now, who are Jesus' brothers? Who are Jesus' brothers? The Bible actually records for us the names of Jesus' brothers. Matthew chapter 13, verse 55. Let me read that for you. Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? Are not his brothers James and Joseph? You'll see that elsewhere, Joseph. James and Joseph and Simon and Judas. These are his brothers. Think on those names. Maybe make a little note about those names, those 4 men, and keep that note in your mind on your paper there. It says, no one works in secret, verse 4, if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. If? What do you mean, if? Hasn't Jesus been healing? Hasn't he been multiplying bread and fish? Hasn't he been doing all sorts of works, all sorts of signs and wonders? And now they say, hey, if you actually do this stuff, Why don't you go do it on the big stage? Why don't you go do it in Jerusalem? Nobody does these works krupos or cryptically. Nobody does these works secretly if they want to be known openly. Well, let me ask you, how has Jesus done these works secretively? He's just done works all over Galilee. He's done works all over Israel. What are they doing here? I'll tell you what they're doing. They're putting Jesus to the test, is what they're doing. If you really do these things, how about you do these things when and where we tell you to do them? That's what they're demanding. It says in verse 5, for not even his brothers believed in him. This is the first expression of unrighteous judgments, the unrighteous judgments that come from unbelief. You can write these down. They're all formatted the same. You just change out the last two words. Beware the unrighteous judgments expressed through presumptive appeals. Presumptive appeals. They presume to have the authority to request or demand that Jesus perform miracles at their timing, in their way, at the place of their own choosing. Wow, they presume a lot, don't they? Yes, they do. And why do they presume to make these appeals of the Son of God? Because they actually don't believe in him. For even his brothers didn't believe in him. Oh, well, let's condemn his brothers, but let's look in the mirror on this as well. Because there are many times I fear, I know in my own heart I have done this, and I would assume that you're probably not a lot different than me in this way, that we make presumptive appeals to God. God, if you love me, you're going to come through in this way and at this time. You're going to give me what I want. You're going to give it to me when I want it. And Lord, I'll praise you for it. Lord, I'll thank you for it. Lord, you're going to change this scenario and change this circumstance. And if you do it, I'll give you glory. But you got to do it. What are we doing when we make those kinds of appeals? We are presuming to have authority over God. God has become our servant rather than we being the servants of God. What is this about? This is about unbelief. God, my belief in you is conditional. It is conditional on whether or not you're going to do what I want you to do. In that scenario, let me ask you, who is God? Not the miracle worker. In that scenario, the creature has become God. The creature demands a miracle. The creature demands a change. The creature demands it here, now, when I say it. What does it all come from? It's unbelief. It's unbelief. When we demand that God do things our way, in our timing, in the way in which we think, we are presuming upon God. And we are being idolaters. We are being unbelieving. So here it is. Watch out for that. Beware. You may not actually demand anything of God. You may not say, God, if you do this, I'll believe in you. But if God doesn't come through in the way that you think he ought to, or in the timing you think he ought to, have you ever gotten angry with God? Let's be honest. I have. Why, God? Why? Why did you allow me to feel this way? Why did you allow me to think this way? Why did you allow me to behave this way? Oh, that's not God's fault. I'm presuming upon God in my own unbelief. No, belief says, Lord, your ways are right. Your ways are perfect. Your timing is impeccable. And Lord, if I get upset about it, it's because I'm wrong. And it's because I am unbelieving. And Lord, I ask you to change my heart. So just beware. Beware of unbelief being expressed through presumptive appeals. You see, these brothers of Jesus, even as close physically as they were to him, they don't know him, and they don't know his Father's plan. For even his brothers, verse 5, not even his brothers believed in him. Jesus said to them, my time has not yet come, but your time is always here. Now, what does Jesus mean? My time has not yet come. What does he speak of when he speaks of his time? Well, it's actually quite easy to understand what Jesus means by this when you read the Gospel of John as a whole and you see all the reference that Jesus uses to describe his time. I could put all of those together and say that the timing of Jesus is the manifestation of his glory, which begins a one-way road to suffering and death on the cross and resurrection. It is the timing of his being revealed to the world. And Jesus says, that time has not yet come. So I'm not going to go up to Jerusalem with you in this way or at this time, because the time for me to be known to the world, it's not yet. It's not yet. John 2, 3 through 4, and this will help you to remember not only that, but also to understand why Jesus performed this first miracle in such a private manner. John 2, 3 through 4, you remember this. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, they have no wine. And Jesus said to her, woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. His mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. Woman, what? You're telling me they have a need and they actually need a miracle performed? Why are you telling this? My hour has not yet come. If I perform a miracle here, everybody's going to know. And it's not for them to know yet. And so what does Jesus do? Jesus does perform a miracle, but he performs the miracle only in front of the servants. He tells the servants, you go get the water, you bring the water back over here into these jars, into these cisterns, and then you go tell the master of the feast, come and taste. And he's going to taste the water out of the cisterns, and in fact, it's turned into the best wine man has ever made because man didn't make it. The God-man did. And does Jesus perform this miracle in front of the disciples? In fact, he performs this miracle in front of the servants who are waiting tables. Why does he do it privately? Why didn't he just walk out in front of everybody and say, hey, they're out of wine? Watch this. He doesn't do that. It's not for them to know. In fact, he only demonstrates it to the least of all the people. John chapter 12, verse 23, speaking of Jesus' hour, his time, and Jesus answered them, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. What does Jesus say about his hour? His hour is the time of his death. It is the ultimate manifestation of his glory in this willingness to express the love of God through his death on behalf of sinners. And I tell you that this is very glorious. This is the ultimate expression of glory, that Jesus would come to the earth, that he would live as a servant, as the slave of all, and he would pay a debt that he did not owe and die for the sins of the world. But when did he do it? I'll tell you when he did it. He did it when his hour came. He did it in the perfect timing of God. He didn't do it too early and he didn't do it too late. He did it exactly when the Father had determined by his own sovereign choosing. That is not for man to press. It's not for man to speed up the works of God. It's not for man to slow down the works of God. So Jesus says, my hour has not yet come. John 17, verse 1 through 5. When Jesus had spoken these words, he lifted up his eye to heaven and said, Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that the Son may glorify you. Since you have given him authority over all flesh, to give eternal life to all whom you have given him. And this is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom you have sent. I have glorified you on earth, having accomplished the work that you gave me to do, now, Father, glorify me in your own presence with the glory that I had with you before the world existed. You see, there is an intricately woven plan of redemption that God is carrying out. Jesus' brothers say, you go here when we tell you. You do what we tell you to do. And Jesus says, my hour has not yet come. When my hour comes, it's a one-way road to the cross and to being resurrected from the dead. You don't get to choose that hour. You don't get to speed it up. Oh, they presume a lot here, don't they? They presume a lot in their request and their appeal. Jesus said to them, verse 6, my time is not yet come, but your time is always here. Well, what do you mean? Verse 7, the world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify about it that its works are evil. It says, your time is always here. What does he mean? He says, your time of being revealed to the world, it's always here. Why? Because you're just like the world. You're just like the world. They can't hate you because they don't hate themselves. They love themselves, and that's why they love you, because you are just like them. Now, when Jesus uses the word cosmos here, he's not talking about the spherical planet that we live on. He's talking not only even just about the inhabitants of the world, but he is speaking about the unregenerate, ungodly inhabitants of the world. And he says, the unregenerate inhabitants of the world, they cannot hate you because you're just like them. They're lost. You're lost. You are of the world. They are of the world. Jesus is of God. They are not of God. So when Jesus is manifested to the world because he is not like them, what will they do? Miso, they will hate him. They will despise him. Did the world ever love Jesus when he performed the miracles? Never. They always demanded more. And they always acted like they didn't experience blessing from God. Typical of the world. To enjoy the blessings of God, not give him thanks. Isn't that what the Apostle Paul said in Romans 1, Dietrich? Though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give him thanks. Therefore, God gave them over to debased passions. So Jesus says, look, your time is always here. Because the people that you want me to reveal myself to, guess what? They hate me. You go up there, you go party with them, you go be one with them because you already are one with them. Jesus is not of the world. Why does the world hate him? What did he say in verse 7? Because I testify, martyreo. He says, I give legal testimony that its works are evil. They're not of God. John 3:19 through 20. And this is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and people loved the darkness rather than the light because their works were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his works should be exposed. This is what Jesus came into the world testifying to. The world's works are evil. And those works of evil must be atoned for. Jesus is not affirming the world in its unrighteousness. Jesus was dying for the world as its sacrifice. So Jesus says the world's not going to accept me, but the world will always accept you. Your time is always here. John 15:18 through 20, let this be a little bit of comfort to you, that if you are hated in the world because you are like Jesus, it tells you that you are united with him. John 18 through 20, if the world hates you, says Jesus, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Remember the word that I said to you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they kept my word, they will also keep yours. This is why many people fall away when difficult times come. They want so desperately to be loved by the world. They do not want the world to cancel them. They do not want the world to ignore them or to marginalize them, because they would rather be identified with the world than the Savior of the world. So they abandon the Lord because they were never truly with Him. They were always of the world, and their time is always here. But Jesus' timing had not yet come. And what does He say here? Verse 8, you go up to the feast. I am not going up to this feast. Now, when you read the Greek text, there is an anomaly here. You could, in fact, many of the translations render this verse, I am not yet going up to this feast, for my time has not yet fully come. After saying this, He remained in Galilee. Many of the translations render that word in the Greek, they render it as not yet going up to the feast, because when you read verse 10, what does He do? He goes up to the feast. So did Jesus just deceive them? I'm not going up to the feast. And then He goes up to the feast. Is He deceiving them? I'll show you a couple of ways as to why He is not deceiving, or how He is not deceiving them. It says, you go up to the feast. My time has not yet fully come. Plerao. It has not been completed. All the things that need to be done in my ministry have not yet been completed. So I'm not going to go up to the feast now. After saying this, He remained in Galilee. So He stays up in the north country. But it says this in verse 10, now that we look at the unbelief of the Jewish crowds. But after His brothers had gone up to the feast, so they go to the south and ascend the mountain of Jerusalem. After they had gone up to the feast, then He also went up, not publicly, but in private. Jesus just told His brothers, I am not going up to the feast, or I am not yet going up to the feast. You go on ahead. Now, how has Jesus not just deceived them? Well, if He has told them, I'm not yet going up to the feast, then it's very easy to understand how He did not deceive them. You have a couple of temporal words here. It says, after His brothers had gone up to the feast, then He also went up. So there was a difference in timing, wasn't there? There was a difference in the timing of His going up to Jerusalem to the feast. Not only was there a difference in timing, there was also a difference in the manner of His going up. How did his brothers want Him to go up to Jerusalem? He said, show yourself to the world. You go on to the big stage, you perform some miracles, because if you're really doing these things, why would you ever do them secretly? Do it in secret. Just go up to Jerusalem and perform your miracles there. Jesus says, no, my time has not yet come. So what does He do? Well, it tells you right there in verse 10, He also went up after them a different time and in a different way, not publicly, but in private. He doesn't go up publicly, He goes in private. And in fact, when you read through the remainder of chapter 7, you see that when Jesus went up to Jerusalem for the Feast of Booths, He did not perform any signs. He went up privately, and He would not perform the signs that His brothers demanded in their unbelief. So He went up in different timing. He went up in a different way, in a different manner. He went up privately. Now, when He gets there, how are the Jewish crowds going to respond? Well, they're going to respond in the same way. They're going to respond in unbelief. Look again now at verse 11. The Jews were looking, there it is again, zeteo, the word for seek. The Jews are seeking Him. It says the Jews were looking for Him at the feast, saying, where is He? Now, when you read that in the English, it doesn't exactly convey the ugliness of the statement that's present in Greek. When it says, where is He in the English, the word for He is actually the word ekenos. Where is that one? Where is this one? What are you talking about? This one who performs miracles. Where is He? We want to see that one. We want to see that guy. It is quite pejorative and ugly in the original. It says, where is this one? And there was much muttering. That's the same word for grumbling that you find there in chapter 6. It says, and there was much muttering about him among the people, while some said, he's a good man. That's a correct statement, but it's quite insufficient, isn't it? He's a good man. They're not saying he's the Son of God or the Christ. Some are saying he's a good man. Others said, no, he is leading the people astray. Quite the mixed opinion about Jesus. None of them calling him the Christ at this point. Some, he's a good man. Others, he's just leading the people astray. But what are they all? They're all unbelieving, is what they are. You can have differing opinions about Jesus and still be unbelieving all the same. And it says, yet for fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly of him. Mark that in your mind. Why are these people grumbling, muttering under their voice? He's a good guy. He's a good man. No, he's leading the people astray. Why are they all talking in the back alleys? Why are they all muttering under their voice? What does it say? Yet for fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly of him. For fear of the legal authorities. What are they fearful of? They won't even talk openly about Jesus. What are they fearful of? We need to answer that question because they're going to make an accusation about Jesus here in just a few verses. Why would they keep silent? You know what they're afraid of? They're afraid of being put to death. They're afraid of being lumped in with Jesus. They're afraid of the Jews because they know exactly what the religious leaders want to do with Jesus. Mark that. They know exactly what the religious leaders want to do with Jesus. They want to put him to death. Continue looking here. It says in verse 14, about the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and began teaching. The Jews therefore marveled, saying, how is it that this man has learning? Twice before you saw Jesus in the temple in the Gospel of John. The first time was in John chapter 2 when Jesus drove out the money changers and the merchants from the temple. He made the cord of whips and drove them out. You think that was endearing to them? Probably not. The next time you see Jesus in the temple in John's gospel was in John chapter 5, verse 1 through 18, when Jesus went to the pool of Bethesda on the northeastern side of Jerusalem, and he healed the invalid man by the pool. That man, he did it in secret, by the way. That man went into the temple, and Jesus found him later, and the text tells us in John 5, now the healing took place on the Sabbath day. Nobody was marveling that Jesus healed the man, but they were all angry that he did it on the Sabbath day. That's the last time that he was in the temple, and now he's in the temple again. And what is he doing? He is teaching. But how do the people respond? Verse 15, the Jews therefore marveled. They're amazed, saying, how is it that this man has learning when he has never studied? He's never been a disciple, Menthano. He has never sat under a rabbi to teach him. The literal rendering of this verse is, how does this man know his letters? How does this guy even know how to read? They're not marveling at his teaching. They think he ought to be a dummy. How does this guy even know his letters? How does he know how to read? Nobody's ever taught him. Well, it's another manifestation of their unbelief, isn't it? Because in order for them to know their letters, they got to go to school. In order for anybody else to stand up in the temple and teach with authority, they've got to sit under a rabbi for many years. So, of course, Jesus must be like us. If he knows his letters, he had to have gone to school. If he teaches in the temple, he had to have sat under a rabbi because he must be just like us. Everybody's just like me. Well, beware. Beware the unrighteous judgments expressed through arrogant assumptions. Arrogant assumptions. Well, if somebody knows how to speak, somebody knows how to read, they must have gone to school. Well, not this man. And somebody knows the scriptures, they had to sit under a rabbi. Well, not this man. You see, Jesus didn't need to sit under a rabbi to learn the scriptures that he himself inspired. He's the big A author. He actually wrote the book. But they so arrogantly assume this man must be just like us. He's not just like you. He has flesh and bones like you, but he ain't nothing like you. Well, in their unbelief, they just assume so many things about Jesus. Arrogant assumptions. Marvel, how is it that this man has teaching? Learning when he's never studied. Verse 16, so Jesus answered them, my teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. I did take a discipleship course. And I took a discipleship course at the throne of the Father. That's who I learned from. My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. Here he's going to burn them down here, verse 17. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority. He says, look, if you actually wanted to do the things that God wants, you would know whether my teaching was true or not. In other words, the reason you don't believe my teaching is because you don't seek to do God's will. That's why you don't receive my teaching. It's not because it's false, it's because you are unbelieving. Well, how is it that someone who affirms the will of God, who is seeking the will of God, is going to believe the words of Jesus? I'll tell you, the only way to believe the words of Jesus, the only way to seek the will of God is to have God perform a miracle on you. It's for God to have done the miracle of faith giving to you. Remember what Jesus said in John 6:44. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up on the last day. Same chapter, chapter 6, verse 63. It is the Spirit who gives life. The flesh is no help at all. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and life. John 8:47. Whoever is of God hears the words of God. The reason why you do not hear them is that you are not of God. Jesus is saying the same thing here that he said there, John 8:47. If you were trying to do the will of God, you would believe what I'm saying. You would know whether or not what I'm saying is true. What is he telling them? You don't believe God. You're not seeking to do his will. You're not seeking to obey him. He says in verse 18, the one who speaks on his own authority, he seeks his own glory. But the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there is no falsehood. Jesus says, I'm a true messenger of God. He says, I'm not sitting here telling you anything that I've come up with. I am telling you what the Father has told me. If I were coming to you seeking my own glory, speaking from myself is literally what it says. If I was speaking from myself, seeking glory that comes from you, I would tell you what you want to hear so that you will love me. But because I tell you not what you want to hear, but because I tell you what is true, regardless of if it offends you, you know that I'm speaking on behalf of somebody else and I'm speaking with their authority. He says, the fact that I don't try to seek your glory, that ought to tell you that what I'm saying is true. Nonetheless, they don't believe. They don't believe because they do not have the gift of faith. They don't have the ability to believe. So they make the presumptive appeals to God. They make these arrogant assumptions about Jesus, these arrogant assumptions about God. More than that, look at the next verses. Verse 19. Has not Moses given you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. Why do you seek to kill me? Jesus knows the thoughts of their heart. They want him dead. And he just says, has not Moses given you the law? But you don't keep the law. You break the law. You don't want yourself to die. But then again, you look at me and you're wanting to kill me. He says, why? If you break the law of Moses, shouldn't you die? The soul that sins shall surely die. This is what Moses' law says. But he says, no, you're seeking to kill me. Why are you doing this? Why are you seeking to kill me? You are the ones who are lawless. Listen to their response to Jesus. Verse 20, the crowd answered, you have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you? You're crazy, Jesus. You're demon possessed. You think people are trying to kill you? Are you mad? Are you insane? Well, you look back up there, verse 13. They knew that the Jews were trying to kill him. For fear of the Jews, they wouldn't speak openly of him. They knew this. And now they're trying to cover up their unbelief. They're trying to cover up their sins. And what do? They make fraudulent assertions. They are willing to lie to cover themselves. They are willing to lie to try to avoid guilt. Beware. Beware the unrighteous judgments expressed through fraudulent assertions. People who do not believe in Jesus will lie all day long about him. They will lie all day long about his word. They will say, hey, doesn't the Bible say this? And you actually go read the Bible and it doesn't say that. There's all sorts of people on the news stations that appeal to the Bible but have never actually read it. There are all sorts of criticisms and blasphemies that get spewed from politicians and news media about the church and about Jesus and about the Bible that are false. Why do they do this? Why do they make fraudulent assertions? Because they don't believe, and they don't care. They will say whatever they want to say or whatever they have to say to get their way. They are liars. And they are children of the father of lies. Beware. Beware of unrighteous judgments expressed through fraudulent assertions. This is not the only time. They just said to Jesus, you're demon possessed. To Jesus. John 8:48. The Jews answered him, are we not right in saying that you are a Samaritan and have a demon? They're willing to lie and say anything. He's born in Bethlehem. He grew up in Nazareth. He's not a Samaritan. He's not demon possessed. John 8:52, the Jews said to him, we know that you have a demon. Abraham died, as did the prophets. Yet you say, if anyone keeps my word, he will never perish. John 10:20, many of them said, he has a demon and is insane. Why listen to him? Mark 3:22, and the scribes who came down from Jerusalem were saying, he is possessed by Beelzebul, and by the prince of demons, he casts out demons. These unbelieving people are willing to say anything blasphemous about God. Anything. Now look here in verse 21. Jesus answered them, I did one work. And you all marvel at it. What is the one work that Jesus is referring to? It's the work that he did in Jerusalem the last time he was there. Again, John chapter 5, verse 1 through 18, you read of Jesus healing the man, the invalid man who had been invalid all his life, paralyzed, and he's there at the pool of Bethesda, and Jesus heals him. But when did he heal him? He healed him on the Sabbath day when you're not supposed to work. And he said, I did one work, and you're losing your minds. Well, it says in John 5:16 through 18, and this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, my Father is working until now, and I'm working. This was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. Jesus says, I did one work. I did one work, and you're losing your minds. You're marveling about this. He says in verse 22, Moses gave you circumcision. This is the covenant in the flesh. Moses gave you circumcision. Not that it's from Moses. You read that command in Leviticus 12. not that it's from Moses, but from the fathers, which you actually see the covenant work of circumcision given in Genesis 17. Abraham must be circumcised, and his son and all of his male descendants after him, as a sign in their flesh that they belong to Yahweh. It says, Moses gave you circumcision, not that it's from Moses, but from the fathers, and you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. If on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision, so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well? You know what he called them? Called them a bunch of hypocrites. You're hypocrites. He said, I did one work on the Sabbath day. I told the man to get up and pick up his bed. And you're losing your minds. And yet when it comes to the obligations on you, you got no problem performing circumcisions on the Sabbath day. Because you say, I have to do the will of God. But what's good for you is not good for me. And you're angry with me. You do this thing to the flesh, and you cut away. And yet I healed this man's whole body. And you get angry with me? Well, beware. Beware the unrighteous judgments expressed through hypocritical assessments. Unrighteous judgments of unbelief. They're expressed through hypocritical assessments. The world is willing to pass judgments on the church that they refuse to pass on themselves. They say that the church is unloving towards women because the church wants to abolish abortion. And yet how many women have been aborted out of the, 60 or 70 million babies that have been murdered? How many women have been murdered in the womb? Tens and tens of millions. And yet it's not the world demanding the abolishment of abortion. It's the church demanding it. And one says, well, now that Roe versus Wade has been overturned, boy, the church better do something about adoption. And I look around in every congregation I've ever been in, and I see adopted kids all over the place. I don't see any unbelieving organizations stepping up to fund adoptions. The world does nothing for orphans. The church does. But what is the world willing to do? They're willing to make hypocritical assessments all the time. All the time. It's not the world that abolished slavery. It was the church that abolished slavery. It's not the world that's spoken up against Hitler and the killing of the Jews. It was the church. It was the church that spoke up against abortion. It's the church who provides for families. It's the church who cares for women. It's not the world. It's the church and the teachings of Scripture that preserve marriages, not the world. But the world is very willing to be hypocritical in its assessments. So what does Jesus say? Do not judge by appearances. Verse 24. But judge with right judgment. Don't judge based on what you think you see. Why don't you make a right judgment? Well, the point is this. They can't make a right judgment. Because making a right judgment about Jesus requires faith. It requires believing His word. It requires trusting in Him. But of all the seeking that these people are doing, they're not seeking to believe in Him. They're not seeking to trust in Him. They are unrighteous. They are unregenerate. In fact, they are hostile to God. They express their unbelief through presumptive appeals, arrogant assumptions, fraudulent assertions, and hypocritical assessments. And this is just the few that are mentioned in this passage. These are not all of them. We live in a dark world, don't we? We live in a dark world full of people who are unrighteous and make unrighteous judgments. And the fact is that, but for the grace of God, we're the same. And we have got to beware of these expressions of unbelief. We have to pray that God increase our faith. Pray that we don't behave in this way. And you know what we need to do? We need to believe that God is able to change the hearts of people. I told you in verses 1 through 9, that whole section is about the unbelief of Jesus' brothers. They grew up in the same household as the Lord, and they didn't believe. Was there any hope for them? During his ministry, they're not following him. They're not loving him. They're taunting him, making presumptive appeals of him, not trusting in him, not standing by him. Is there any hope for somebody that's unbelieving and that is that hostile to God? You better hope there is. Because without hope that God can change such a person, where would we be? You've probably got a family member or two or more, friends or two or more who are unbelieving. And when we begin talking about these presumptive appeals and arrogant assumptions and fraudulent assertions, hypocritical assessments, you think, that's that guy, that's that lady, that's my cousin, that's my dad, that's my mom, that's my sister, that's my brother, that's them right there. Can God change them? Yes, he can. Let me read a passage for you from Acts chapter 1, verse 12 through 14. It seems like an unlikely passage to end a sermon on, but it says, "Then they returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet." What happened on the Mount of Olivet in Acts chapter 1? Jesus ascended into heaven, been raised from the dead, and almost about the time of the Feast of Weeks, Jesus ascends into heaven, and there's a crowd there watching. Then they returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath's day journey away. And when they had entered, they went up to the upper room where they were staying, Peter and John and James and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon the Zealot, and Judas the son of James. All these, with one accord, were devoting themselves to prayer, together with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and his brothers. Glory to God. It took Jesus living before them, dying before them, and being raised before them, and being ascended to heaven before them. But they finally believed. The Lord changed their heart. It's not a matter of when a person comes into the family of faith. It's a matter of if a person comes into the family of faith. And the truth is, God can save anybody. 'Tis so sweet to trust in Jesus, just to take him at his word. Would y'all pray with me?